What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the E4 Explicit Podcast. And today I talked to a dope ass FBI profiler, Mark Safarik. He worked and ran and did a lot in the BAU, the Behavioral Analyst. The BAU, the Behavioral Analysis Unit, which some of you may have seen on that show, Criminal Minds, which we talk about in this in this episode. And it's crazy, man, because we really dive deep into the mind of these serial killers who are infamous: Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, BTK, Gary Ridgway, which you can find my episode of the King County Sheriff that I just did with King County Sheriff, or former King County Sheriff Dave Reichert, who was one of the people who caught Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Anyways, Mark is an incredible, fascinating, intelligent human being, and I was so glad to have him on. I love talking to feds, but really these high-level behavioral guys and gals who are just in it, right? They've lived their whole career through this stuff, which is kind of terrifying because they really have to dive deep and become and think like these infamous killers, act and their behavior to try to catch them, which is crazy. So this one is insane. I love it. Mark's a good guy. Like I said before, watch it all the way through. Don't not watch it. Also, if you would like this video, please like it. Also share it if you want. Drop a comment below, but also hit that bell notification so you get notified every single time that I come out. Okay, I come out all the time, every Friday, right? Took a little hiatus over the holidays, but I'm back every Friday. You'll see me. So hit that bell notification so you get notified. Also, subscribe to the channel, guys. We just 2 or 3 episodes ago, we did Carol Baskin. Holler at your boy, Carol Baskin. That was awesome. Anyways, back to Mark. But yeah, subscribe to the channel, like the video, help me out, get the algorithm pumping, and really start sharing the stuff so YouTube puts it in front of more people. Anyway, enjoy this episode with Mark Safarik, former FBI agent and profiler for the feds. I'll see you next week. Peace out. This episode of the E4 Explicit Podcast is brought to you by Bravo Concealment. Bravo Concealment is known for some of the best high quality and concealable holsters on the market. Located in the great state of Texas, they offer free shipping and unlimited lifetime warranty on all of their products, and a 30-day money-back guarantee if you don't like the product. I've been using Bravo Concealment for my gun holsters ever since I got into guns, and the quality is by far, bar none, the top notch in the entire industry that I've seen. And right now they're doing a buy one, get one free, plus free shipping, the 30-day money-back guarantee, and a lifetime warranty. On top of that, you, my friends, will get 10% off of any product, of any purchase on their website by using Explicit10. Use the code Explicit10 and you'll get 10% off your entire purchase from BravoConcealment.com. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the E4 Explicit Podcast. I'm Corey, and today we have former FBI profiler Mark Safarik. Thank you so much, Mark, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Sure, Corey. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Absolutely, man. So tell my audience, the viewers and the listeners and everybody who's paying attention, your background. Give me a little bit about your background and kind of your experience and career, if you could.
Sure. Well, so after I graduated college, I had actually never even thought about going into law enforcement. I was really going to go into medicine. So this is by the time I had graduated college, law enforcement had never come up on my radar. But I was interested in sort of keeping my hand in this medical field, and I ended up working as an EMT paramedic on an ambulance in California. And that put me in touch with law enforcement, going out on calls, shootings and stabbings and assaults. And wherever I went, there was typically police. And I just became interested in the type of work that they did. And so I went on a citizen ride-along program. I was at the University of California, Davis at the time. I went on a ride-along program with city police. And, generally you go for an 8-hour shift, and you get to see how the cops operate. And you go one time, and that's it for most people. But I kept coming back and kept coming back. It was crazy. I mean, like at about the 13th time I'd come back, the sergeant I was riding with said, "Hey, why don't you become a reserve police officer?" So that's what I did. Put myself through the Sacramento County Sheriff's Reserve Academy, became a reserve officer. I did that for like a year, started, working as a 2-man unit. And then after I got experience, I had a 1-man unit. And it was really then when my career changed from medicine to law enforcement. I just became fascinated by law enforcement. So I applied to be an officer, got in, went to the police academy, the same drill. You start in patrol, worked all 3 shifts, days, swings, bids. But I really wanted to do investigative work. So after about 3.5 years, I applied to be one of the detectives, and started in property crimes, went into violent crime, homicide, sexual assaults. Absolutely love the work, love the investigative work, love the challenge of investigative work. And I know this sounds like, I'm leading up to something, right? So, I mean, it's like, how did you become an FBI profiler? We're getting tired, but I went to this homicide school in 1982, and
Homicide school.
Homicide school. Well, I was working homicide, so
right.
Went to this homicide school, and there were 2 FBI profilers that came to give us 2 days of instruction, and that was the turning point for me. I was absolutely mesmerized by this way of looking at complex human violent behavior in a way that I'd never had before. I was really managing cases in a homicide or a sexual assault case, managing the case, managing evidence, managing leads, but really never taking the opportunity or really the know-how how to step back and look at a case forensically and behaviorally.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a couple of homicide. I had a double homicide and a single homicide, both unsolved, that were complex and I thought would be good cases to submit to the FBI's profiling unit. And that's what I did. As a detective, I submitted them through the local FBI office. And that's what put me in touch with the profilers back at Quantico. And so that I developed a relationship with them. And after about a year, I really decided that's the kind of work I really wanted to do. And the only place I could do it was in the FBI. So I applied to become an agent and took about a year. It's a long process, but I got in and I, started off my career working violent crimes on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. And then I went to New York City, and then I went to Sacramento. And when I was in Sacramento, where I was working violent crimes, this is now I'm 11 years into the FBI. Finally, the opportunity presents itself where I can apply to the behavioral unit, because we hadn't had any openings before that. So I applied and got in. And that is why I went into the FBI, to do that kind of work. And when I got into the unit, I basically stayed till the end of my career. So I spent maybe 12 and a half years in the unit, 23 years in the FBI.
Wow. Damn.
I know. It was, and I loved it. I loved every second of it. But when I retired, I actually joined Bob Ressler, who was one of the big names in profiling, written the books. I joined him as his partner. I'd done everything in the Bureau that I thought I could do. I was doing research. I did research, a lot of research and publications in sexual homicide. I taught all over the world. I worked cases all over the country and all over the world. I'd worked the most interesting and complex cases, as most of the agents in the unit had. So I really had done what I wanted to do. And it was when it was time to retire. I mean, I'd been eligible for 3 years, but I loved the work so much. But then I got the opportunity to join Bob Ressler, which I did. And now Bob got sick fairly soon afterwards and was unable to continue the work. So I continued the business, and now I'm approaching 15 years with Forensic Behavioral Services International. So it's been a great journey, but I still love the work. I'm still publishing, doing research. I'm still doing a lot of television work. I still do testify as an expert witness, do complex cases, both criminal and civil cases. I still teach. I still travel. So, and I do podcasts.
That's awesome. So you've been blessed with the career in the FBI. And then it's funny because every FBI agent I talk to literally tells me I loved every minute working for the Bureau, and everything they got to do. So that doesn't surprise me. I do want to take it back to the transition from being a beat cop, because before you get into anything detective wise, you got to earn your street cred a little bit there.
Sure.
What was it? It's a side note about myself. I went to the police academy. I was looking to be a homicide detective, and then I was like, wait, I have a problem with authority. That's not going to work. And also, I got to be a cop for like 6 or in the precinct I was looking to. Like, they had like 2 homicide detectives, and like they were not going anywhere. So it would have been a long time unless if I moved around. But my thing was, I always had a knack for like, I felt like all the cops that I would talk to were like, I wanted to be a detective because like I came after the problem or during the crime, whatever, and then I had to hand it off. Like,
see, that's what for me when I was a beat cop, and I was college educated. So back, when I came into the police force in mid 70s, a lot of cops, unlike today, where most have a 4-year degree, a lot of cops only had high school educations,
right.
But I had a 4-year degree. And so I could write articulate reports, which made me competitive after 3.5 years for a detective slot. But like you, like when I was working patrol and I'd get a burglary case or I'd get an assault, I'd do the initial workup, but then I had to hand it off, right? And then you're back to doing and I didn't want to hand it off anymore. I wanted to be the guy that got handed off too.
Right. See it through. Yeah.
Yeah,
yep,
exactly.
Yeah, that's kind of like the what I got from a lot of the cops and stuff like that. And honestly, I didn't have the patience to wait like 7-10 years to be a detective. So I went a different route, and then I became a filmmaker, and it's paid off for sure. And then I love the decision I made. But I just always found that was kind of like, I always want to know the reason why cops wanted to be detectives. And I found myself like, well, I don't want to just stop and then go back to doing it and then stop and then go back. I want to see it through, make sure these people solve it.
I think being a street cop is great, and it takes a long time to get your street creds. And some guys really love that kind of work. They love, and then they get into a sergeant or lieutenant's position or captain's position in patrol, and it's the type of work they love. And I like street work. You get you meet a lot of different people. You really understand a lot about people when they tell the truth and when they're not telling the truth. So that becomes helpful when you become an investigator. But I just really wanted to take that next step. And that's kind of like when I was a detective and then you're working these complex homicide cases. Instead of handing it off to the Bureau profilers, I wanted to be one of the profilers that got handed off to these complex, unusual, difficult violent crime cases. Because, most agencies have good homicide investigators. The agencies I've worked with around the world, top-notch homicide guys. But sometimes you have cases that are just beyond the pale in terms of behavioral dynamics. They're very complex. They're excessively violent. They have a lot of dynamics happening within the crime. You have maybe have multiple victims or multiple offenders. That is not in the purview of your average homicide guy. And they'll work the case, but at some point, these cases go cold, and that's oftentimes when we would get called in. Or if it's a high profile case like a serial murder investigation or spree killing, something where we might get called in much earlier.
Right. Okay, good. That's perfect segue into what I wanted to chat about next is serial killers. So I found you on I forget what the show's called, but it's on A&E. It's a documentary. It's fantastic. It just recently came out. It basically, which I never knew this, and I've been weirdly obsessed with serial killers my whole life. Not like, I guess weird. But like I know a lot about them, and it's weird when I talk to people and like tell them about the stuff. They're like, "Why do you know so much about this?" I'm like, I don't know. It's just interesting. I'm a curious person.
Yeah,
So,
right.
I didn't know that, not that they were doing it at the same exact time, but the five pretty much the most infamous serial killers: Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, BTK, Gary Ridgway, who was the Green River Killer, and Jeffrey Dahmer, were all somewhat operating around the same time within the same years, which I never even knew that. So let's talk about that show a little bit. Not even just the show, but like those cases. I don't want to dive too much into the cases. If anybody wants to Google all those people, there's tons of stuff made.
There's lots out there. Sure.
There's no need to really go into those cases, but more of like those are the most prolific serial killers in the 70s.
Well, it's not, they were prolific.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that this was sort of the golden age of serial killers in the early 70s. And I think it was a culmination of a lot of things. And that's what the show Invisible Monsters really is showing you. And I think it's like when A&E put it out, it was 3 nights, 2 hours each night. What we tried to do in that show, because there's lots of shows about, Dahmer and Ridgway and Gacy, Bundy. But what we tried to show was, how did all of these guys, why were they so active? And why did it take us so long to catch them, right? As opposed to now. And there's a whole number of reasons which become very interesting when you put them all together. From the fact that we didn't have a 911 system, we didn't have computers, we didn't have any databases like we do now. In the FBI, we were searching fingerprints on paper cards, fingerprint cards, and we were rolling fingerprints. Police would roll fingerprints. They send the fingerprint card in the FBI. We would then catalog that into a card file. We had millions and millions of these cards. So, now you have the automated fingerprint identification system. You have AFIS, you have CODIS, which is the DNA database. You have DEA has their drug database. BATF has their cartridge database. We have NCIC, which we did not have. NCIC didn't start until the late 1970s, early 80s. So we didn't really have a way to communicate with other law enforcement agencies. The FBI had a teletype machine. So we would send out a teletype, really, and it would go to but it would go to a large office like, say, LAPD. Well, of course, who's going to get the teletype, right? It's not a good way to communicate. Even when I came into the bureau, we didn't have cell phones. I was lucky I had a pager, right? So,
wow.
Yeah, so communication, no 911, no surveillance cameras, no computers. And sort of the culture at that time too, very permissive sort of culture. If you think back to like Ed Kemper and Bundy, people used to hitchhike all over the country. Hey, when I was growing up, I lived in Southern California. I surfed, and I used to hitchhike to high school every day. And I would hitchhike to the beach to go surfing. So you rarely see people hitchhiking anymore. But women used to hitchhike all the time, and they became prime victims,
right,
until you start realizing that you make yourself a target. And then that gets, that information gets out there. But it was a very permissive culture at that time. And so you have all of these things coming together. And in terms of forensics, what did we really know how to do?
Mm-hmm.
Even when I started as a cop, when I'd go to a crime scene, our cameras were film cameras. We had flash bulbs. So, I remember my lieutenant telling me, hey, film's expensive. So, be judicious about the photographs you're taking at the crime scene. And I know, like I would get photos from LAPD. And so I worked the Rodney Alcala case, the dating game killer case. Rodney Alcala recently died on death row in San Quentin. But I was getting these cases from Southern California. Now, this was maybe like not too long ago, because I was doing the Alcala case for the New York District Attorney's Office. He was already a serial killer in San Quentin. But I was getting these sexual homicide cases from LA. They have like 25 photos, right? It's amazing. 25 crime scene photos of a sexual homicide. And you just go,
That's like nothing.
Now we have, we do 600-700 pictures because they're digital, but we didn't have that back then. We didn't have, the ability to do the kind of forensics. We weren't doing DNA. I mean, DNA didn't even really come around until the early 90s. Mm-hmm. We were doing blood groups, right? So, fingerprints, we weren't, we weren't using cyanoacrylate or vacuum metal deposition or any of the tools that we have now. Are, the communication systems, as I mentioned, not very good, no databases. So when killers like Bundy, who operated across the country, there wasn't any communication between agencies. You cross state lines, you cross county lines. How does one agency know that this case is related to another case? In fact, in Bundy's case, and we talk about it in the show, that was the very first time that a task force had been put together, a multi-state task force with investigators from Washington and Utah and Colorado and Oregon.
Florida.
No, not Florida
after.
At the time, because
later,
Bundy got there later. But with the killings, it was the very first task force, and now task forces are very common, and the cold case investigations. But there were just all of this came together, and of course, I mean, in terms of media coverage. Back then, what did we really have? We had this big three, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and the rest were on UHF channels, right? So we didn't have 24/7 coverage. We had daytime news. If murder was covered, it might be covered locally. Now you have a spree killing in Nebraska. It's instantaneous news everywhere, maybe internationally.
Right.
So there was no media coverage of these cases. So all of this was gelling in the 70s and 80s and early 90s when these guys were active. And I don't think today, with the technology and the investigative acumen that we have, that these guys would be near as prolific. And here's another interesting fact. So, if you're going to talk about serial murder, we didn't even define it until 1977. My partner, Bob Ressler, was the person that coined the term serial killer. So before that, we talked about murders in series. We oftentimes called them mass murders, because they had a lot of victims. But if you don't even have a way to define it, how do you know what you have? Right. And this is 1977, before we even really define this term and start going out and teaching law enforcement agencies about this phenomenon. And then, of course, in the mid-70s, early to mid-70s, the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit started going out and interviewing, because they would get these cases from the National Academy. The officers, investigators from around the world would bring these complex cases to the FBI. A lot of them were serial murder cases, mass murder, spree murder, sexual homicides, unusual equivocal death cases. And they'd ask the Behavioral Sciences Unit, hey, what do you think about this case? And a lot of times our response was, we don't really know.
Right.
We decided, we need to know, right? So we started to develop a research program and go out and interview these serial killers and ask them, like, how do you select your victims? What do you think about during the crimes? Why do you choose these weapons? How do you operate? How do you feel? All of these kinds of questions, which we do now. There's lots of research, but there was no research into these people. So we didn't really understand serial killers in the mid 70s and early 80s. We were just getting our hands on these guys and starting the research. So, this is part of it as well. We didn't really know about serial killers. We were in the process of doing research, And of course, all of that adds to the general knowledge that we have now, right? My research, others research, their criminologists, lots of universities and that have criminology departments doing a lot of research in homicide, sexual assault, violence against women, violence against children, violence against the elderly. So, what we had in the 70s is nothing really and even in the early 80s was really nothing compared to what we have today. And I think that's why these guys who really have names that everybody knows. Now, maybe in 20 years, people, they'll go, who Ted Bundy, like who's Ted Bundy, right? But most people, if you talk about Gacy and Bundy and Ridgway and Dahmer, they're going to know who these are. These people have, name recognition because they had lots of victims, or like Dahmer, they were so bizarre, right? Or like BTK, didn't have a lot of victims, but he just really heinous individual, brutal. So, and then they went over long periods of time, 10, 15, 20 plus years, before they're actually apprehended. But those guys operating today, that there just wouldn't have that kind of body count. I think we would be not only from the science aspect, the forensic science aspect, we would be onto these guys, but simply because we understand these types of killers, what motivates them, and so it's a great series because we tried to pull all five together and look at all these different aspects, of science and culture and electronic communications, what we did have, what we didn't have, because people talk about serial killers like you are and saying, why, how did Bundy get away with this for so long? How did Ridgway, how did he have, 60, 70 victims? But you can't look at it through the lens of 2021 or 2022. You have to look at it through the lens of 1972. Right. Where were we in law enforcement, in understanding, in research, in databases? We had no databases.
Nothing. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it's funny because a couple of things to unpack on that part is when I talked to Dave Reichert, who is the King County sheriff, he was a homicide detective. He's the one that was kind of like leading the charge for the most part for Gary Ridgway at and he got the tail end of Bundy too, because that was King County as well. So he was in it was astonishing when he was telling me the process of when he would go process a crime scene. And I just was like, what? I mean, just like you're saying, the fingerprints, I mean, hundreds of thousands of just boxes of just paperwork of things that they had to document. And if you didn't have the wherewithal and the kind of foresight then to collect maybe that piece of evidence, maybe it'll be useful in 20 years, then there it goes. It's gone. It's crazy.
Well, if you think about it, when you have a big investigation like Bundy or Ridgway, and we don't have any computers, everything is on paper. Right. So you have hundreds and hundreds of boxes of documents. And when you're asking the public for assistance and they're calling in tips, you have to investigate every single call. The thing is, a lot of them are crackpots, a lot of them, they're nothing. But the problem is if you say, this doesn't sound good, let's not investigate this, it may be the one clue that solves the case. Now it's not a problem. We have linkage analysis software. We can put all this stuff in. We have, computers. So everything can be scanned. You want to find a person's name, in 1.5 million documents. You just ask for it. Find this name, and it'll pull up every document. Can you imagine doing this with 300 boxes of paper files? No. There's no way. So trying to manage leads in those cases, because you have to essentially prioritize leads. you get a lead in, and then you have investigators who go, okay, is this a good lead? Should this be like one we do right now? Or can this wait a couple weeks? Or is it a low priority lead, right? You got to prioritize leads because you're getting thousands of them, right?
Yep. I have a bunch of holsters from Bravo, and one of them is the inside the waistband holster. So this goes inside the waistband if you want to conceal carry. Also, swap it out here, outside the waistband. So this outside the waistband is actually like hella thin, and you can see kind of like how close to the body it can get. You could take this on the range. You can probably conceal this and comfortably do it with, you know, a hoodie over top or whatever. If you want to open carry, it's up to you. They also send out mag pouches, right? So you can throw in an extra mag. You're going to the range. You don't have to unload and reload every single time. You got a little hollow point moment. They come in handy if you're on the range, like I said, or if you're concealed carry and you're one of those people that are gotta have a lot of mags or whatever. You know, whatever your cup of tea is. They also send you these really cool pamphlets. They go into great details in these brochures of how to wear things properly, safety mechanisms, and all the features that all of these holsters have as well. So they really focus on educating their customers, which when it comes to guns, safety and education are number one. They don't have any left-handed holsters except for the Glock 19. I'm a lefty, but the right-handed holsters are so dope and they're so comfortable and concealable that I don't really give a shit. Just learn how to shoot with my right hand. And right now they're doing a buy one, get one free, plus free shipping, the 30-day money-back guarantee, and a lifetime warranty. On top of that, you, my friends, will get 10% off of any product, of any purchase on their website by using explicit10. Use the code explicit10 and you'll get 10% off your entire purchase from bravoconcealment.com.
Problem with paper, it's still a problem even with a computer, but you know, computerizing it, but you know, it just takes manpower and hours of investigative work.
Right.
weeks, months of investigative work.
Yeah, you're right. When he said that, because it's funny. He was like, he told me, he's like, you know, because he kind of left the Ridgeway case, and then when he became King County Sheriff, he brought it back and created another task force and built and bulked that up. And then they obviously called him like pretty soon after he started that. But he was saying like, we kind of knew, like when we got the DNA and everything and we got it approved and was confirmed it was him. Like, he's like, when his partner showed him the envelope and like opened the picture, he's like, he guessed who it was before. And same thing with somewhat of Gacy a little bit. Ridgeway, BTK basically caught himself with the whole floppy disk thing. He might still be out there. It's like crazy.
Yeah. So, and even so, I worked the Robert Lee Yates serial murder case, Spokane serial murder case.
Yep.
Same type of thing. You know, a lot of these guys, when they're operating in one geographic environment, so it's different than guys who travel from state to state, but like Bundy makes it more difficult. But when you're in one geographic area, the likelihood that you've contacted your suspect at some point is pretty high.
Right.
You can't filter them out. You don't have the wherewithal or means to filter him out of the conversation. But, you know, sometimes these guys' names keep cropping up, right? Especially when you're dealing with prostitutes, right?
Right.
Because guys that troll for prostitutes, you know, they're out there and police can stop them and talk to them, you know, and when you start talking to this, you know, your guy's going to be in that group, you know, if this is going over years at some point, you know, it's just figuring out who it is.
Right. And the evidence to confirm that person that was the hardest part. Like you said, they had no technology and they basically had to wait for technology to catch up with their investigation is kind of what he told me.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I filmed a TV series in Sweden. I did 2 seasons of a cold case homicide show. In the first season, we did this case of a young girl who'd been raped and murdered. Her name was Malin Lindstrom. And the police had on the zipper of her jeans, they had a couple of sperm cells. But when they did this investigation, the technology wasn't there to do it. They knew it was the offender
Wow.
right? Because she was a young girl. She was found out in the woods. They knew it was almost certainly the offender because of the location, but they realized that if they did the analysis and they couldn't get anything, they would have used the sample up.
Mhm.
So they held this case for many years. I mean, like 10, 15 years, um, knowing that technology would catch up and they would be able to. And just maybe like, I think it's less than a year ago, they finally did the analysis. So, sometimes it's like Dave was saying, you're waiting for technology to catch up. You've got what you
Got
believe
it.
is good
Yeah.
evidence.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
You
Right.
know this is the offender's evidence, which you don't always know. Is it evidence that, like, you find fingerprints in a residence? Well, I mean, could the person have just been in there at some point?
Right.
Not during the homicide. So you have to find the evidence has to be in a place where it suggests that it's part of the crime,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Yes.
But when you find it, and sometimes you go, we can't analyze this yet. I mean, this is what we're doing with lots of old DNA cases now, going back to cases that we've had 20, 30 years ago, when
Mhm.
we didn't have that ability, and doing the DNA, and also, the genealogy, right?
Ah, yes.
So
Yes.
so now you can, and thanks to things like DNA Ancestry and 23andMe, people want to find out their ancestry, but those DNA samples oftentimes go into a database,
Hmm.
right? And then you find people that are linked, have some relationship to your suspect, and you work it backwards.
Yep.
It's amazing, but
It really is amazing. A Golden State Killer, the old man that
right,
just, yeah, like that. A friend of mine, he's an economist, Anthony Davies. He actually worked. He was one of the person that started up Parabon, which is the company that does that
right,
technology in Virginia.
yep.
And CC Moore, I think her name is the girl that has the TV show, The Genealogist, and she worked it backwards. That stuff is freaking crazy, man.
It's amazing. It's weird, but I actually worked on that case
Oh
when
wow.
I was a police officer.
And didn't even know it.
And at the time, this guy, at the time, he was called the East Area Rapist. So he had different names in different locations. So this was just outside Sacramento. He hit twice in the area where in my agency's area.
Wow.
And I remember doing rooftop surveillances with night vision goggles, because we were pretty sure he was parking out a long way out and running across fields to get to these houses. And so we were covering these field locations with night vision goggles. I must have worked 5, 6, 7 different nights on the East Area Rapist, because we never caught him at that time. But and then it turns out, many decades later, we arrest him. But he was, and I did work on the case.
Wow, that's
as a,
crazy.
spending cold nights on a rooftop watching through
And night vision.
night vision goggles, or binoculars we had. I mean, they weren't great, but you definitely could see if someone was crossing. So I had a small part in that case.
That's
Very,
awesome.
very small.
It's funny when we talked about the evidence that is just, it's there like in the 70s and 80s. And like I always wondered, and I forgot to ask Dave this too, but you probably know, like he gave me the example of when he was doing Gary Ridgway. He ended up taking one of the things that Gary choked one of the prostitutes with,
Yes.
that was getting covered by the river, and kept it. And that was actually the piece that got Gary and confirmed it was him, because it had the paint particles from his Kentworth job, and they were able to match it. My thing is, back then, there's really no training that these officers are getting to be like, hey, make sure when you go to the crime scene, get that sperm cell. Like, or is like, or do you have to be like a special individual to be like forward thinking enough?
Well, clearly it's both. So when you're collecting evidence, and if you were collecting evidence in the 70s in the homicide case, we didn't have DNA, so we were working with blood groups. But if you're forward thinking, you're thinking like, this rope is definitely, this was the rope she strangled with. Now, we can examine this rope and we may not find anything, but in 20 years or 30 years, we may find something. So we may find those tiny paint particles. We may find DNA, contact DNA. So this is what we look for oftentimes when an offender grabs something, like they pull the victim's clothing off and where they would pull it off, or they're strangling with a rope, that where they're holding the item really tight is a good location to find contact DNA. Even on the victim themselves, if they're being strangled, you can find contact DNA on the skin. Now in the 70s, of course, couldn't do that. Right. But if you're forward thinking, you are collecting that evidence, all of the evidence, and you're preserving it. Now, I mean, how many cases was evidence destroyed or lost? It just depends on the agency and how they were able to keep the evidence. Whether was it secure or was it, did they keep it from getting wet or moldy? And but it's very important because you have to look at these things and go, yeah, we can't get anything off this rope, but maybe in the future we should keep this, and then we'll, in 20 years or 10 years, we'll go back and see. But you'd have to be forward thinking, to look at that from that perspective.
That's fascinating to me. I just think that's so, because you think it's like, oh, this is it. This is what we got right now. You don't really think of like, hey, in 20 years, we might be able to use genealogy technology and find out this.
We didn't even know. We didn't know about DNA. So we didn't really know about genealogy.
Right.
But, you're looking at this rope and going, oh, we can't get anything off this. It's clear the rope he strangled her with, but, there's nothing on it. We've looked at it under, a microscope in the lab, but there's nothing on it. Well, yeah, there's something there. You just can't see it now, right? Or you can't collect it now. But if you preserve it, not only preserve it in terms of for time, so that it stays intact, but you preserve it legally, right? So you don't lose chain of custody on these things. This is what we're doing now. We're bringing a lot of these cases back. You read it almost every day in the news. Somebody solved a 35-year-old murder case, or it doesn't even have to be a crime. It could be identifying a missing person. Right?
Yep.
We've had this missing person for 45 years. We finally identified him through genetic genealogy.
Right. It's so crazy.
Yeah. So it can be a lot of things.
Right.
Really.
That's fascinating. And I mean, you already answered my one question. I was going to ask, would it be hard to be a serial killer nowadays? Because I don't see really anybody that's like has a body count of like more than 10, like ever, like let alone 50, 60, 40, 30. I mean, but you answered all that already. I mean, I think it's obvious.
I think it depends. Well, it depends, the country that this is happening in. True. Right. I was called in a case down in Brazil, and so law enforcement down there, if you're in a big city, yeah, it can be good, but if you're not, do you have the ability, or do your labs, or do they have that standard?
Right.
Are your investigators, do they know about how to do these kinds of investigation? That was one of the reasons that I got called on it. So it just depends on where it is. And also, serial killers, murderers, they watch the news, they watch shows, they understand that, if you're half smart, that what police can do with evidence. I remember getting a case, as I did research in sexual homicides of elderly females. So I would get a lot of these cases. And I got this case once where the woman had been sexually assaulted and murdered, right? This elderly woman, she was about 87 years old, but the offender had cut all of her fingernails off, all the way down to the quick, all 10 of them. Is almost, you know what he's doing, because that at some point she probably tried to scratch him, or did scratch him, right? And he recognized that there's going to be DNA under the fingernails. And so he's not going to let the police collect that. So he actually trimmed all of her fingernails. Now, when she was dead when he did this, but he cut them all the way down, into the skin line, just to, and then took them with him. So, yes, so sometimes you do have individuals who are thinking ahead, and making some effort to either take evidence with them or destroy evidence. But we're pretty good, in this day and age that, they may miss something. They're not, always the brightest individuals. And even if they are bright, there's always something that they miss. They can't think of everything. So I think, what you said and what I said earlier is we just don't have these kinds of long-term killers, 10, 20 years with, body counts in the 60s, 70s, 80s, just because we're much better in this country anyway. So it just depends on where you're doing that investigation.
Right. That makes sense. Because some countries might be stuck back in the 80s and 70s, technology wise, to an extent.
Even further back than that,
Right.
And, yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah. Well, you brought up the coining of the serial killer, which brings me to my next question, which is a show that I love, Mindhunter. I'm sure you're familiar with it. So that show kind of, I thought, I don't know, listen, I'm not an FBI agent. I don't really know anything about that kind of stuff, but it seemed very legit. And the serial killers that were in it were like spot on.
Yeah, they did do a good job of that, of getting people that were very similar to the eerily similar.
Yeah, that was
crazy. I think they made a very good attempt to sort of replicate what the FBI was doing initially in its serial killer research. I mean, and this is just personally for me, because in the show, the two main characters are essentially supposed to be John Douglas and Bob Ressler.
Yep.
But in the show, they have the younger character as taking the lead in this, and that would be Douglas, and the older character, more seasoned agent, Ressler, sort of either laying back or not expressing that much interest. Actually, the roles are flipped. Ressler was the one that started this research, was the one that wanted to go out and do the interviews, and asked Douglas who was a junior agent, in the unit, if he wanted to go with him.
Wow.
So Ressler was actually the one that was pushing the research, pushing to do the interviews. So the show is incorrect in how the two characters, but that's just something for me because I know, right?
You
Bob was my partner. Right. So most people, almost everybody, they just enjoy the show, right? And it's a good show. And I think they tried to keep it true in terms of, where we were. This was at the beginning when we were, we wanted to understand these kinds of killers and what motivated them and how they thought about the killing and how they selected their victims. How do you do that? Well, you have to go out and talk to them.
Right.
You go interview them and you ask them these questions. You develop a research protocol, and then you go and talk to them. And it was great back then because they'd go on a road trip school where they're teaching law enforcement, a bunch of homicide guys, give them a school, and they go like, hey, let's go interview Charlie. He's over in Vacaville, and they would just stop by Vacaville prison and go, hey, warden, FBI, we're from the behavioral science unit. Can we interview Charlie? We'd be like, yeah, let me see if he wants to chat with you. And those were the good old days. You can't do that anymore because now you have interview research boards. There is no way that you can just stop by a prison if you're like a researcher or FBI agents, researcher. And I knew this from my research I did later on. You have these institutional review boards, and they are a beast to get through. And these guys have to sign all these kinds of waivers. You have to sign waivers that they could be, mentally affected by talking about their crimes. I mean, it's
Wow.
the amount of paperwork that you just can't stop by. But that's how we did it, right? Sort of, we never asked for permission, even from the FBI. They weren't asking for permission. They just were like, hey, we're at this road school. Let's go talk to Kemper. Let's go talk to Manson. Let's go talk to Son of Sam.
Oh my
Let's
God.
see what they have to say. We learned a lot, but the old saying, better to beg for forgiveness
than ask for permission. That's
which is what we did. And the guys got in trouble for that because the Bureau didn't really know what they were doing, but they got the information and they published it, and that spurred more research. I mean, it certainly spurred my research. I remember going to Roy Hazelwood, who's another one of the giants in the unit, and I wanted to do some research as well. And I asked Roy, like, what should I do research in? And he goes, find a niche that nobody has explored yet and become an expert in that. And that's what I did. I ended up, when I first got into the unit, getting assigned a couple of these sexual homicides of elderly women out of Colorado Springs. There was like an 87-year-old woman and a 92-year-old woman.
That's where I'm at.
Viciously raped and brutally murdered.
Jesus.
And, you ask yourself, what kind of person does this?
Just about to say that. Who does that too?
Right. Who does that? And that is the question detectives who get these kinds of cases now ask, because they're used to dealing with homicide cases, but this is a different type of case.
Yes.
And I asked myself the same question. So when I ask the question when I'm trying to do research, the first thing I want to do is find out who's done research in this and read the research. The thing was, there'd been no research in this area.
Right.
There'd been research looking at sexual assault of elderly women. Some lived, some died. But I was interested in just sexual homicide. And there'd been no research in that. So I found my niche and I exploited it. I started research in 1996. I have published many papers on this. I published book chapters. I developed a homicide injury scale.
Wow.
That I've published on based on this data set. I developed a strangulation study based on this data set. And so now we have a lot of research in this particular area of sexual homicide. Is it a big area? No, it's not. Do you see that a lot around the country? No, you don't. But when you get those cases, which detectives, when they get those cases, they'd be like, what is going on here?
Right.
And I remember out of Detroit, Michigan, because I published a paper with him. His name escapes me at the moment, but he was a seasoned homicide guy. He investigated like 500 homicide cases. And he got this 93-year-old woman who'd been raped and murdered and left nude on her bed with a knife sticking in her chest. And she'd been stabbed in the sexual areas. And I mean, it was brutal. Wow. And when he got this case, like he had seen homicide cases, so many, but he said he walked into that crime scene and he was like, what the hell is going on here? He goes, I have no idea who would do something like that.
Where do you begin?
Right. Well, so you can be a seasoned homicide guy. You get a case like that and you're like, oh. And he ended up talking to a homicide detective friend of his. And that guy had happened to go to a conference where I had been speaking about this. Wow. I've been lecturing about my research. And he said, hey, Dave, you want to call this agent at the behavioral analysis unit. He's been doing research in this area. And he called me on the phone and I hadn't seen any photographs. I hadn't seen anything. We just talked on the phone. And he told me about his case. They had like 50 potential suspects. And I said, okay, based on the research, this is what you're looking for. This is what your guy's going to look like. This is about his age. This is going to be his race. I went down the line. And he said, you know what? I got a guy like that. And it turns out it was the guy. Now, I mean, it's not that easy in every case.
Yeah, it's like,
in some are unsolved. But the thing is that the research told us some things about it. And after that case was solved and he was arrested and prosecuted, Dave and I got together and we wrote an article about the merging of behavioral science, police investigations, and the forensic science, how the lab and the police investigators and the behavioral people all came together to solve this case, right? And it's a really great marriage of, what we do. Because, what I tell people is, like, law enforcement has lots of tools in their toolbox, forensic science and all kinds of things, from fingerprints to shoe prints, and hairs and fibers. Behavioral analysis is one tool in the toolbox. It is not meant to solve your case, but it is meant to give you useful information that can move your investigation forward or narrow a pool of potential suspects, which is what I did with Dave.
Right.
Well, we narrowed a potential pool of about 50 guys down to like 2 or 3, and he was in that group. So, people think that profiling we're there to solve the case. We're not. We want the case to be solved, but we're there to provide a specific tool in complex homicide cases, typically cold cases where you've run out of leads in the case and you're getting a fresh eyes look at it from a behavioral perspective. Because these are the kinds of cases that I look at day in and day out. I've looked at thousands and thousands and thousands of these cases, not your run-of-the-mill homicide cases, but this weird, complex behavior. And then when I see that kind of behavior in another crime scene, I understand what that dynamic is based on my training, my experience, my education.
Right.
And then I offer that, to law enforcement, because we don't typically come into a case until either it's well into its investigation or, police are going, it's cold. How do we move this case forward? I don't know. How about having the profilers, FBI profilers, take a look at it?
Right.
Maybe they can. And
it's fresh eyes.
We can.
Yeah.
It's fresh eyes, but it's also fresh eyes from a different perspective.
Right. Yeah.
From a behavior. And the advantage is that, I don't have a dog in the fight, right? I don't have a relationship with the victims or their families or suspects or their families. I'm not in the community. I'm not tied into this whole thing potentially emotionally. I'm just going to stand back and look at this objectively and tell them what I think, for me is going on here.
Right.
And then, they can take that information and move it forward, or, they can ignore it, which a number of agencies do.
Right. Yeah.
So it isn't meant to solve the case. And I think a lot of people, get that wrong about profiling. It's a tool. It's a very useful tool, but not in all cases. So most homicide cases are not good cases for profiling. Just because it's a homicide doesn't mean it's a good case. There has to be some significant psychopathology within the case. So something for us to look at, some dynamic interaction. Right. So drive-by shootings.
I was just about to say drive-bys.
And even a lot of prostitute homicides just are not going to have that kind of rich background that you need in these cases. Serial murder cases typically have it, but you collect it from lots of different cases. Even if you're talking about prostitute cases, if you've got a lot of cases, you can glean pieces from all of them. But it just takes a certain kind of case. And I've turned down countless cases when agencies have called me. I'm like, I don't think I can help you with this. There just isn't enough there.
Yeah. I tend to agree with you with the whole kind of idea of a profiler, like it's the end all be all. Well, no, it's just a tool, because I think a lot of I think of Criminal Minds, right? They blow it up like they're always solving the case. And obviously that's a TV show and it's exaggerated, but yeah, they were I didn't even know what that was until I saw that show. And I'm like, oh, these guys are the saving grace. They come in, they solve the case, and
and they're doing everything. That's so.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's the other thing is that we have a really specific job, and we don't, it isn't 6 or 7 people going out on a case. Our unit was small. We only had 8 profilers in the adult crimes unit. So I was in adult crimes. So we did all the adult homicides around the country and around the world. So when you only have 8 people, you're not sending, you can't send 5 and 6 people on a case.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can send 2 on a serial. I've never gone with more than one other person on a case. We don't fly in a G5 jet that's owned by the Bureau. The Bureau does own a G5, but the only person that flies in that is the director. And it isn't FBI profilers. We fly commercial. And, we're not experts in DNA or all these other, things that they do.
Mm-hmm.
We have an expertise in a particular area. And, we don't do the investigation. That's the other thing. So these guys, in the show, they're going out and doing all this stuff, but we don't do that. It's not our case. We've been invited in to assist on the case. We come in, we assist as best as we can, and then we leave. Right. And if we make recommendations about doing something investigatively, it's them, because it can't be us, because they have to testify about it. It's their case.
Right.
If we start doing things, then, then we would have to come in, testify about what we did. So these are the recommendations we make. So the show is mostly entertaining, right? But in terms of reality, not
accurate. Right. Yeah. So I know we got like a couple more minutes. I have one question is, how does one, because we talked about this on the phone, how do you get into, because you have to become kind of think like a serial killer. You have to understand their behavior, why they're doing certain things. Is there an MO? They keep doing the same thing. Is it a typical kind of run of the mill serial killer? Because I've always seen all the serial killers have what in common? They have mother issues and they kill animals, right? That's the stereotypical.
Well, that's not true, but
I know. Yeah. Right. But that's I think the stereotypical thing of people think that that's a profiling thing. But can you kind of explain?
That's sort of the homicidal triad that has been debunked, but it was like bedwetting, fire setting, and animal torture, right? And yes, you do see that in serial killers, or you see certain aspects of it. But the other on the flip side is you see those things in lots of other kids too, right? They don't become serial killers, right? Just like school shooters. When we did the school shooting assessment, the FBI published a school shooter sort of a monograph. We found a lot of hallmark areas in these kids and the school shooters, but we always cautioned, you can't use that as a checklist and go, oh yeah, I've got a kid in my class and he checks off all these boxes. He must be a school shooter or a potential school shooter, because there's lots of kids that have those that never become school shooters. Right. So just because they have it, and we've sort of debunked that homicidal triad thing, but yes. And, I think the media propagated a lot of that, white males in their mid-20s who hate their mothers, right? Is sort of, that's the serial killer, but
literally
you have Hispanic serial killers and Black serial killers and, Asian serial killers. In every culture, you have serial killers. Right. So, this country is 86% Caucasian. So yes, you're going to have more Caucasian serial killers just simply based on population dynamics. Right. So, I think the question you were asking really has to do with being able to dissociate yourself emotionally from the material that you're looking at. Right. And, I've had training in lots of areas from forensic bloodstain analysis to forensic pathology. I used to teach for the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in their basic forensic pathology course in psychopathy. So you have expertise in a lot of areas that you can bring to bear when you get these cases. Could be forensic entomology, right? And you have a buried body case, so you have a lot of insects. you need that expertise, or forensic botany. So you can bring an expertise to bear on the case. I've had a training in a lot of these areas. Could I testify as an expert in court? No. But do I have an expertise that helps me in these cases? Absolutely. And then the education, in the training and all these courses that I have taken, doing research in the area of homicide. You read hundreds and hundreds of cases. And then the experiential value of working these kinds of cases, not only my cases, but all of your colleagues' cases, sitting in on a serial murder case of 50 individuals, young males down in Louisiana, or 12 in another case. Not all my cases, but sitting in a consultation. So you have a lot of experience working these cases, and then you bring that to bear on the cases that you have. And you need to stand in both the victim's shoes, because you have to understand how the victim got into this position and why the offender is making these choices and selecting this person, and either taking a lot of risk or trying to minimize risk. What is the decision process? And then, what is the weapon use process? What is the injury process? And what is the postmortem activity process? What else is going on here? And all of these things have some meaning to each other in the constellation of the totality of the circumstances. So you look at everything as as a whole. Like, I don't pull a piece out, a very unusual piece, and go, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't really mean anything by itself. It only means something within the context of the MO or the ritualized behavior. So you need to understand it that way. And that's the way that I think about it. And also, by the time we're getting called in on many cases, they're cold.
Right.
And this is sort of like the last ask. And so I feel a lot of burden to do justice for the victims and their families, and render the most truthful assessment that I can give. And I can't do that if I allow myself to get sucked into an emotional aspect of the case. As horrible as the case might be, I need to remain distant.
Right.
And I think that is the hallmark of a good profiler, is being able to do that and not become biased, not become emotionally overcome with the brutality that you're dealing with, and try to really assist the agency and bring justice to the victims and to their families. And that's the way I've always looked at it for me, and
right.
always recognizing the limitations of what I can do.
Right. Yeah. That makes total sense. And like not getting confirmation bias, not getting emotional, looking at it strictly from kind of like a high level overview of everything else, the data that you have, and especially if it's a cold case. I mean,
there's lots of biases, and
right.
Confirmation is a big one, but tunnel vision.
Yeah.
I see that a lot in investigations. I've worked so many cases where the investigators are just sure they know who did this, right? And they've spent years of their life working this case in that direction. Can you imagine how difficult it is when you look at a case and you go, you're looking at the wrong guy.
Yeah, he's over here, not right here,
Yeah, then you're looking at the wrong people, or
right.
this is not how I assess it, and here's why. And it's hard to say. Nobody wants to go, you know what? I just wasted 2 years of my life doing this, taking this case in the wrong direction. Nobody wants to say, I should have seen that.
Right.
They get very protective about their cases.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And they, they're heavily invested in it. I'm not invested in it. Right. I come in and I don't have connection here. I'm neutral. I said, I don't have a dog in the fight here. I'm just here to assess all the stuff that you have and tell you what I think, and try to to do the best thing. Sometimes it's I did this case in Wales. It was a mass murder case. It was a mom, her mother, and the woman's two little girls. And it was, I don't remember the year I did it. It was probably 15 years ago or so, but it was, at the time, it was the worst mass murder in Wales in 25 years. It was horrific. It was really bad.
Really brutal.
And the investigation had been working on this case for a year. They had a 75-man task force working this thing. And they asked, they weren't getting anywhere on this thing. They asked if they could come over and present it. So they did. They presented it over 2 days to about 4 of us. We laid out what we thought was going on here. At the end, they told us about these suspects that they had. And literally, I mean, my jaw about hit the floor. I'm like, I know. And I talked to my colleagues. I'm like, that's okay. This is not 3 people. This is a single offender. And your offender is much younger than these 3 or people you're looking at. Well, they went back and arrested. They thanked us. See, I think what they were hoping, which is what happens in a lot of cases, is that we would confirm for them that what they were doing, we agreed with.
Right.
And in fact, we did the exact opposite. We said, these are not your offenders. And they basically thanked us and left. And then they went back to Wales and they arrested these 3 individuals. They held them for like 96 hours. They released them. And then a year later, they ended up arresting a single male, much younger, who was the offender in the case. And, sometimes it just works out that way, where they're not looking for the truth.
Right.
They're looking for affirmation.
Yes.
From us that you guys are on the right path. You guys have got it. Right.
Yep.
That's not what we had.
Right.
And I've had that in a number of cases. And sometimes the agencies and the detectives especially get really upset.
Oh, I can imagine.
But
I mean,
my job is not to make you happy. My job is not to confirm what you're thinking. My job is to tell you what I think the truth is. Now, I could be wrong.
Right.
Right. But when I'm assessing this case, this is how I look at this.
Right.
This is the truth for me. And it isn't just like, this is my opinion. I support this because I typically will write a report and I will support this information in, if I see staging behavior or undoing behavior or depersonalization or ritualized behavior.
Data.
Or posing or displaying. What is all of that? How is it different from everything else? Why is it at this crime scene? What does it mean? And I will walk, and I've testified in big cases here in the United States as an expert witness testifying about this kind of stuff. This crime scene was staged. This is depersonalization. This is undoing behavior. And this is what it means. And this is what it means in terms of your suspect.
Right. Of how to identify that type of person or who is doing it. And then, like you said, most times they might have a handful of people that do fit that they're not even looking at.
Right. A lot of the cases that I testify in, the suspect is already in custody. Right. So I'm not, and I don't interview them. I'm looking at crime scene behavior. So my job is to assess the dynamics of the crime. And my job is not to say, yes, I looked at this whole case and yes, that guy sitting over there is the guy that did it.
Right.
And so that's not my role. That's the jury's role. That's the judge's role. My role is I don't ever identify anybody. My role is to talk about behavior and what it means. And then the prosecutor or the defense attorney takes that information and goes, yeah, and all of this put together points to him, or all of this put together doesn't point to my client.
Right.
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 It's up to the jury to make that decision. It's not my decision. And that is actually what they call profiling in criminal cases. And it's not allowed in the courts.
Why?
Because you can't, because you you can't take over the purview of the jury or the judge.
You can't prove it like that is the exact person who did it.
Yeah, I'm not. That's not my role.
Right.
My role is to tell you what my assessment is and what does this behavior mean.
Wow.
That's what it means. Does it have anything to do with the defendant over there? I don't have any idea.
Maybe or
I don't
maybe
know who
not.
the defendant is. I don't
Okay.
even know this person. Sometimes I go in to testify as an expert. I've never even seen the defendant. That's the first time I've ever seen the person.
Wow.
Right. My job, that's not my job. That's the prosecutor's job. Then to take that information, because I only have one piece of the case.
Mm.
You know, cases are complex. They have lots of information I never hear about. That takes investigation takes place later. And sometimes after, if there's a conviction, I might hear about it. You know, they might tell me, "Oh yeah, we found this letter in the trash," right? And like I never knew about it, right? Because it didn't pertain to my, the
behavioral side of things.
Yeah, it didn't pertain to the crime scene for me, right? So there's no need to tell me about it because it might just bias me, right?
Right.
So they have this information. I'm giving them this assessment, but there's lots of pieces to the case. The case might take 3-4 weeks, right? I come in for a day,
right?
Do my thing, and then I leave, right? And then I hear about it later. So then it's the prosecutor's job to take that information, and
right.
But that's you can't do that kind of you can't, and the judges wouldn't allow it anyway.
Right.
That kind of testimony in the court would be, you'd be kicked off the stand.
Yeah, that would work. That's fascinating stuff, man. I really appreciate you coming by. Where can people kind of find you, on social media, your website and stuff like that?
Well, let's see, what is it? 13th. Tomorrow I have a show, there's a show on Chris Watts. He was a family annihilator in Colorado. Yes. That's on Tubi television tomorrow. I think it airs, it's just on, so you can watch it anytime.
What's it called? Because I want to watch it. I'm fascinated.
I think it's called the Chris Watts story. It's called Human Monster, or I don't recall. But it's the Chris Watts a story. I think it's coming out tomorrow, the 14th.
Okay.
But I do a lot of different TV shows. I have a website, Forensic Behavioral Services International, fbsinternational.com, but it's really mostly for work stuff, for attorneys when I do expert testimony work. There's a lot of clips. I had a TV show in 2011 called Killer Instinct, NBC produced. I did 13 episodes of cases that I had. A lot of the really interesting cases that I've done, the Bakersfield mass murder case, this Spokane serial murder case, they're all in there. And then I did a couple seasons in Sweden of cold case homicide shows, and 2 seasons in Denmark of cold case. Well, 1 season of cold case homicide and 1 season of equivocal death cases, which are fascinating. I love doing equivocal death cases. Almost sometimes more difficult than doing a homicide case.
Right.
But I mean, you can find me on the web if you Google me. I've got there's clips and stuff.
We have the technology now. We can find you.
Yes, the technology's out there. Good.
They caught up.
Yeah. So, yeah, right. It's all out there. Never used to be out there. Not in the golden age, right?
No, right. That's awesome, man. Well, hey, thank you so much, Mark, for coming on. I really appreciate it. I always wanted to talk to an actual profiler that understands these cases, and I'm glad I got to speak with you. So I really appreciate the time.
You bet, Corey. My pleasure. I enjoyed it as well.
Awesome. Well, that's another.
And thanks to your audience for listening.
Absolutely. No, yeah, they're gonna be pumped. Like, they love this shit, honestly. Like, they're weirdos just like me, so they're gonna really like diving into the mind of.
Well, I think it. It's television skews
so bad
the way that people look at what we can actually do and what we can't do.
Yes,
both behaviorally and forensically. So I think it's just this is sort of a reality check for people. In true crime shows, you get some of this, you get experts that talk about things, but there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation about profilers, and you had Silence of the Lambs and which really started this whole thing in terms of profiling and FBI profilers.
Right.
Yeah, but then you had Red Dragon, which actually I thought was, which was actually the prequel book.
Yeah, that's like the third one, but it was the prequel.
Really, that was really good. It didn't get much play, but the first opening scene is amazing.
Yeah, that movie. I like the movie.
Yeah, the movie was great.
Yeah, I didn't read the books. I'm not a big
the books were really good.
Yeah,
but the movie was really good. So anyway, just help people to understand what we do, right, and the limitations of what we do is important to understand.
Yeah, I think that's another part is like it's like I said earlier, it's like, oh well, this is like the end all be all. It's like, well, you have one specific job, and if you can do it, great. If you can't, you can't help them. Like you said, like a drive-by shooting, no FBI profiler is going to profile a drive-by shooting. Like that's just not going to work. So
just not enough information.
No.
And I think people should also understand that, we don't insert ourselves into homicide investigations. It's not like, a lot of the movies where you see the FBI, and every time I see this, I just cover my eyes and, just cringe. We don't just, strut into an investigation, go, hey, we're the FBI, we're taking over. I mean, it's just never happens.
To come in.
We are asked. We have to be invited into an investigation. An agency has to make a request of the FBI to have the profilers come in. So it is, that's the vast majority of our cases are cases where we get invited in by the agency. So.
Right. That's awesome. I didn't know that. I thought it was, you guys stroll in on your G5 and
that's it. Just land and say we're taking over.
No.
Sounds good. It works great in a Bruce Willis movie.
It does, but it's not real.
Wear your dark suit and sunglasses and
push
your way through the crowd and tell everybody you're taking over.
This is our.
And when I see that, I'm just like, oh my gosh.
I know.
This is why cops have a bad idea, bad feeling when the FBI come into an investigation. They think they're there to take over, and it's just
a tool in the toolbox.
Tool in the toolbox.
I love it. Well, thanks again, Mark. I appreciate it.
Okay, Corey.
That's another episode of the E4 Exclusive Podcast. I'll see you next time. Peace out. And right now they're doing a buy one, get one free plus free shipping, the 30-day money-back guarantee, and a lifetime warranty. On top of that, you, my friends, will get 10% off of any product, of any purchase on their website by using explicit10. Use the code explicit10 and you'll get 10% off your entire purchase from bravoconcealment.com.